Hello. So this year I read Frankenstein, and it made me think that it might be interesting to compare Frankenstein to the two other really big Gothic novels, which namely being Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I know in another video I said that I believe the correct pronunciation is Jekyll, but that'll just cause a lot of confusion if I keep saying that in the video, I think. So I'm just going to go with the conventional pronunciation, Jekyll. So I read all three of those books, and I want to kind of compare them, talk about how they relate to each other and how they're different. Frankenstein is interesting because it isn't really it doesn't try to be scary. A lot of the things that we think about Frankenstein or what we know about Frankenstein come from movies. In fact, that's actually true for all three of these books. It's not really much of a monster book at all. It has a lot more to say about how we view someone just based on how they look or our initial reaction, instead of actually giving a person a chance. That's really what is going on with the monster. There's a lot more going on in that book, but that's what the monster really is. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a lot more about sort of giving in to these sort of inner passions or inner sort of perversity, and cutting loose your id. That's what that book's a lot about this sort of someone who seems very upright, sort of repressing their devious or skeeving nature. So there's a confliction there with someone who tries to be good but has these sort of really seedy desires, and sort of how he slowly sort of gives into them. It's kind of like a book about addiction in a lot of ways. It seems to me like a book about drug addiction. And then Dracula is really just this guy's bad, watch out, he's going to do bad things. That's really it. There's not a whole lot of message there. There's not a whole lot of extra stuff going on. It's just sort of tries to set the stage for something that's kind of spooky, and then have a spooky thing happen, and sort of does things that feel a little unnatural to the narrative, or seem like that it's kind of like stretching the narrative out a little bit, just to kind of hold off and to kind of like have a creepy reveal. I think of the three of them, the best writing is going to be probably Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Robert Louis Stevenson is also, the only other writer here who has a work that we are also very much aware of, being Treasure Island is also his. And Kidnapped is another big book of his. So Robert Louis Stevenson is probably the best talented writer, or at least his writing is kind of bridges that gap between trying to say something interesting and to keep us engaged. Stoker, Dracula kind of reminds me of like a very popular novel. In other words, it's like he was going for what he thought the public wanted a lot. It sort of feels like that even to me. Like, it just seems like a little bit of fan service, or Stoker sort of plays on what he thought the public wanted to read, and sort of, everyone in Dracula is for the most part good. I mean, there really is no bad person apart from Dracula himself and maybe the other vampires that he possesses. Otherwise, there's not a lot of moralizing going on. Everyone has sort of a different personality, but everyone's like, oh, but in general, mankind is good, and Dracula is this nasty, nasty thing. It does kind of play a little heavy on the religious aspect. For example, when they go to stake and kill Lucy, they have to utter a prayer while they do it. It's not just driving the stake in her heart. That's not enough. They have to pray while they do it. All of them. So I feel like Dracula was really trying to go for this popular novel. He was really trying to be a bestseller. That's fine. It's just that it doesn't have the depth of the other two. There's that. And it makes sense because it is probably the most popular, the most well-known. I mean, if you bring up a classic horror novel, most people are going to say Dracula. It has the most derivative work from it. A lot of our perception of vampires is not exactly from the book. Instead, it's from the movies that Universal made. There's definitely things in the book that are not in the movie, and a lot of our perceptions about Dracula come from the Bela Lugosi movie. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is interesting because it isn't quite what I thought it would be. I think that when the book was written, There's no hint in the title what it's about, and the book at first comes off and sort of plays the long game with, you know, Mr. Hyde is this other sort of very nasty person that Dr. Jekyll has some sort of unfortunate relationship with, like he owes him money, or that Mr. Hyde is blackmailing Dr. Jekyll. That's the impression you get for a pretty long part of the book. And also a lot of the book takes place as sort of like other people talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and their encounters with him. It takes a long time in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde for us to see that there's something supernatural or something unusual going on. And what I think is really interesting about Dr. Jekyll is, especially in the beginning of the book, that we're never really said, nobody really knows why they don't like Mr. Hyde. No one really can specifically say why their gut reaction to Mr. Hyde is like revulsion and hatred. But everybody says it. Nobody can, people even have a hard time describing him. They can't really say, they don't think that he's Dr. Jekyll, but they know Mr. Hyde is just something they hate. They just don't like him. They have a gut reaction of revulsion and hatred towards him. And that's really interesting. It is a little unfortunate that later in the book, it's a lot more focused on the fact that Mr. Hyde, and also is a little unusual, is short. He's not bigger than Dr. Jekyll. He actually shrivels up a bit and becomes to the point where Dr. Jekyll's clothes on him look too big. They don't look right. Like the pants are too long and the sleeves are too long. You know, people constantly comment how they see Mr. Hyde when he's in Dr. Jekyll's clothes, and they think that he stole them. So that's kind of interesting. Not what we normally think of. We think of Mr. Hyde as being this hulking figure, and he's not. He's just like a shriveled, nasty figure. What I don't like about that is that it sort of gives this impression that your character or who you are as a person is reflected in your appearance. I don't really like that a whole lot. I like that Dr. Jekyll's expression, that he's got this sort of expression in his face that nobody can really define that makes them hate him. I like that, but when it's just his physical form, just seen from afar, sort of puts revulsion in people because of his smaller stature and his shriveled nature, and he's kind of hunched, and that makes him a bad person, or that sort of feeds into this bad person loop, is kind of unfortunate, especially since he really is a bad person, and so it sort of supports that idea. That I'm not as crazy about. That to me didn't age as well, but the book is well written. It does kind of languish a little bit right in the middle. At first it's interesting to see this sort of like, oh, there's presenting it as though no one knows and everybody thinks they're separate people, and it kind of goes on for a while. But at a certain point we know, and its sort of interplay becomes a little less interesting, and we still have to kind of languish in it for a little while longer. And that's maybe just a characteristic of the book. It would be really neat to have read a book like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde cold and know nothing about it. So if you ever encounter someone who knows nothing about it, then get them to read that book and say, don't read anything about the book. Like tear the front and the back cover off if you have to, or something. I don't know. Get a cheap copy and do that, and say, just read this book and don't look up anything about it. Just read it cold. And that could be really interesting. In fact, reading books cold is really great if you can find the right book. It's kind of hard to find somebody to curate an experience for you like that, where you can get a good book that you don't know anything about and just sort of go into it never knowing what you're going to expect. So I probably should do something like that for somebody on here, and maybe I will. That seems like a good thing for November. And of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has a lot to say. Of all the books, the pacing is much slower there, so a modern reader who's looking for a Gothic novel, or at least what a modern reader's sensibility of a Gothic novel might be, will think Frankenstein is too slow-paced and may even say it's boring. I don't believe it is, but I think that's your preconceived notion of what Frankenstein is based on Universal movies. You know, Frankenstein is not a book about scaring you. It's not trying to horrify you exactly or anything like that. It's trying to talk about the way we view someone and how what we perceive about them or what we think about them sort of with no interaction, and how that person really is, and how it's not fair. And it also is about someone can sort of look really handsome and be really affluent and have a wealthy family and be a seemingly on the outside at first appearance a great person, and is really not. So really there's this dichotomy between who Frankenstein's monster is, a hideous, almost, anybody who sees him has a gut reaction immediately, just like Mr. Hyde of like revulsion and hatred, compared to what the monster actually is, which is a very compassionate and loving and hopeful person, contrasted against Dr. Frankenstein, who is, who is a handsome and wealthy person, who is well educated and seems to check off all those boxes that we want, but who really is not a good person. He, unleashes this living being with zero input, and just sort of abandons it and lets it do whatever it wants. He just can't, he's like so overcome by his sadness that he just lets it go off and, wreak havoc. Doesn't stand up for somebody who is unjustly tried and killed for something that the monster did. Doesn't really ever take responsibility for the monster. Dr. Frankenstein is sort of like a baby daddy. He doesn't take care of his child. He has no interest in it. He just sort of like hates it and thinks that all his problems come from this monster, this child that he created, and never taking any responsibility for himself. And that's why I think that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein maybe has the most powerful narrative, and especially the ending where the monster sort of finally gets to sort of talk himself to us, not sort of have his story related, because everything up until the very end of Frankenstein is all Victor Frankenstein relating the experience to a young ship's captain in the Arctic. So only at the very end do we get to hear the monster sort of speak his piece and not be sort of overridden or sort of have his narrative distorted by Victor. And I think that speech that he gives is really, really excellent and really poignant, and sort of drives home this thing that Mary Shelley is trying to tell us. So for that reason, I think Frankenstein is perhaps the best of the three novels. I think the most readable, the most engaging is probably Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if only because it kind of does a good job of telling a story quickly, and it doesn't sort of extend the narrative too far beyond what it really needs to be. And it has some interesting things going on in there, interesting plotting, good dialogue between the characters, and just sort of a really interesting story that doesn't overstay its welcome. Dracula is good. It's very much like a popular novel, is what it feels like to me. It feels like a summer read or something like that, It feels like it's very tailored to what he thinks the audience wants. That might be a bit unfair, but that's what I felt when I read it. It just felt like it was a lot less that he had anything to say and more about like, I'm just going to sort of start building for this scare. And there's really not a whole lot more to the novel other than just building for the monster to do something. There's not a lot of depth to the characters. You could probably take any one of the normal characters in Dracula and replace them with another one, and it wouldn't change a whole lot. It just didn't feel, the characters feel very flat. And they're really just sort of tools to sort of set up a scenario that can go, ooh, this is kind of scary, or isn't this kind of creepy, And it's good. Those parts are great. The downside is that might have been better as a series of short stories or something, without these sort of long interludes where we get a lot of those characters that just don't do a whole lot. And Van Helsing, who's often remembered as maybe the other character that we know the most from there, is not very well written. He kind of speaks in sort of a hackneyed sort of English, because he's Dutch or German, and I think it's kind of a disservice to that character that he keeps talking. I guess the idea is that he doesn't speak English very well. It seems like everything else about Van Helsing's personality would indicate that he would have been maybe a little bit more proficient in his English, but whatever. And he also sort of like is this device that Stoker uses to really extend the sort of reveal to that Dracula is a vampire. It goes a long time where he's like, I'm not going to tell you what he is yet. I'm just going to wait. That gets annoying after a while. So some of those moments that we get from that are cool, especially like the reveal of Lucy is good. But some of those moments just feel like they go on too long. So that's what there is for that. So of the three, if you've not read any of them, I think the most digestible, the easiest to come at would be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And then it's sort of a choice between whether you want a novel that's a little more introspective and kind of has a little bit more to say and is kind of a more memorable read long term, which is what you're going to get from Frankenstein, or if you're looking for something a lot more pulpish or a little bit more popular. I should also say that Dracula is the only one of these books that actually deals with the supernatural. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde does touch on the fact that there's sort of this base animal instinct that Dr. Jekyll's tapping into with the chemicals that he imbibes. But for the most part, it's more of a psychological examination of what these sort of hidden, sort of secretive desires that somebody might want, you know, that they can't sort of present to upright society. And so they have this sort of ugly second life that they live, and how that slowly sort of erodes their personality and just sort of overruns everything. Whereas Mary Shelley's Frankenstein never seems like it ever goes in for the cheap stuff. It always takes its time and has a really great thing to say. So, I mean, obviously, I guess it's pretty obvious that I prefer Frankenstein of the three. And that Dracula, I'm glad that I've read it. It's the most acceptable of the three reads. It's the easiest. It plays into those roles. You know, someone who maybe wouldn't like Gothic fiction would like the idea that, you know, Christianity is so prominently featured, and that these Anglo-Saxon type figures are going to have such a prominent role in sort of defeating evil with their Christian beliefs. So I can see where that would have been a very strategic choice on Stoker's part. So that's those three novels. It was fun to read them. It was fun to sort of look at the comparison between the three. So that's those three. That's these three Gothic novels. It was fun to sort of read these back to back and sort of see and kind of compare what they're trying to do and how they do it. And sort of that kind of helped me to understand, you know, the interplay these different novels had and what each one was doing. So I might be something that you might try yourself. I like to try and do something like that, is to read three novels of a similar vein real close to each other. And it kind of, it's like, well, I think of them as being unofficial trilogies. So that was kind of a fun thing to do. It's an experiment that I started doing a long time ago. And so I guess I'll have to do more of that on here. That's it. Thanks for watching.